As with the start of any important event that we do here at Strive UK, we would start with some verses from the holiest of the holiest books. I'm going to invite Rafiha Abdul Qadir to recite a few verses from the Holy Quran. Rafiha, over to you.
Assalamu alaikum.
Salam.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا كونوا قوامين بالقسط شهداء لله ولو على أنفسكم أو الوالدين والأقربين إن يكن غنيا أو فقيرا فالله أولى بهما فلا تتبعوا الهوى أن تعدلوا وإن تلؤوا أو تعرضوا فإن الله كان بما تعملون خبيرا يا أيها الذين آمنوا بالله ورسوله والكتاب الذي نزل على رسوله والكتاب الذي أنزل من قبل ومن يكفر بالله وملائكته وكتبه ورسله واليوم الآخر فقد ضل ضلالا بعيدا صدق الله العظيم.
صدق الله العلي العظيم. Thank you so very much for that exceptional recitation of the holiest of the holiest books. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome everybody to our event today. My name is Naeem Badiou Zaman. I'll be your host for the session today. I am a volunteer with Strive UK, who, as you know, is organizing this very special event today. We are a British Muslim socio-cultural and advocacy organization affiliated to the MCB and set up by young Muslim activists based in the UK. Now, a multicultural organization appropriately representative of Britain. Our countrywide memberships include people from all walks of life, professionals, students, academics, and full-time social workers. As an organization, we are committed to empowering community members, espouse social justice programs, and collaborate with like-minded groups and individuals like yourselves to promote a more egalitarian society. We are prepared to unlearn, challenge norms, and call out on bias unapologetically. And hence, you will see an important subject that we hope to discuss today. As you know, nearly 2 billion Muslims worldwide who come from all corners of the planet, reflecting humanity in all its magnificent diversity, as was said by the UN chief. Yet, as you all know, and very sadly, they often face bigotry and prejudice simply because of their faith. Furthermore, and this is important this special month where we celebrate women and the history of their achievements and the challenges that they overtook, Muslim women continue to suffer triple discrimination because of their gender, ethnicity, and faith. As you would all recall, in 2021, the report from the UK's Home Office, Muslims have been the target of almost half of recorded religious hate crimes. And these are just the ones that the people who are brave enough to report. Many of these instances were where the assumed religion of the victim was not the same as their actual faith. So in effect, this impacts not just Muslims, but the wider community in the United Kingdom. And hate crimes saw an increase of 12%. And sadly, the volume of charges has seen a decrease in recent years, and therefore suggesting a need for further action. And today we have with us Dr. Shaheen Moidunni, who will be speaking to you about understanding Islamophobia, the first step in effectively combating this social scourge. He's finished his PhD from the University of Leeds on the topic Debates on Muslim Political Subjectivity. He regularly contributes articles to several magazines and news portals across the world and continues to engage and advise different Muslim and Islamic movements, intellectuals, community services, on a wide variety of initiatives from media, academics, and day-to-day activities. Today, 15th of March, was designated as the International Day to Combat Islamophobia by the UN. And therefore, today is an important day for us to discuss this. And without further ado, I now invite Dr. Shaheen to speak to all of us. I would like to encourage all of you to engage with us by putting in your questions either throughout or at the end of the session, where Shaheen will, given the time that is available, try to answer all your questions. Over to you, Shaheen.
Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasul Kareem wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Ma ba'd. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. And thank you for the opportunity to organize an event on Islamophobia. And there's no dearth of events or talks on Islamophobia. We had actually in the UK, we also commemorate every November as Islamophobia Awareness Month as well. And just 3 or 4 months after that, the UN has announced recognition internationally on Islamophobia. So if you look at the UN's definition of Islamophobia, it starts with speaking about prejudice and emphasizes, towards the end, labeling Islamophobia as racism. In the UK, we have the distinction of being one of the first nations or communities to actually involve in the discussion of Islamophobia. The first Islamophobia report, there is a running-made report on Islamophobia, it was released in 1997. And 1997, it predates all the rhetoric that followed post September 11th and the war on terror. Now, after 1997, 2008, 2018, there was a call for a working definition of Islamophobia. And the definition was accepted. That was backed by almost 300 Muslim academics, intellectuals, and by the mainstream Muslim organizations, is that Islamophobia is rooted in racism and targets experiences of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. Now, before we give stats and data which you and Shaheen spoke about, the understanding that Islamophobia predated war on terror or the September 11th, it's quite surprising to many. And also, it also importantly marks 25 years since the discourse on Islamophobia in the UK. It's also after 20 years, the Runnymede Trust also brought out a separate report 20 years hence. And 20 years hence, the report was that although they had recommended 60 directives to be implemented in 1997, despite all of the suggestions, recommendations, and debates, things more or less remain the same, or it has gotten worse. Now, to understand Islamophobia, as I think the host said in the beginning, that we have to understand what Islamophobia is before we try to tackle it, or discuss about tackling it. The first way is to understand what it is not. So usually when we speak about Islamophobia as being rooted in racism, and when this definition was put across, there was a lot of pushback from certain sections of the community, the British larger community. For example, the Conservative Party, they completely dismissed it. Certain even intellectuals not associated with the Conservative Party but with the left, they wrote articles in The Guardian criticizing it. So most of the criticisms were, or most of the pushback were around two major issues. One, that Muslims are not a race. Because Muslims are not a race, we cannot call it racism. And the second one was denying the institutional nature of it, or even among the later on that became part of the larger rhetoric on terrorism, that to an extent Muslims are also responsible for creating Islamophobia. Now, what this precludes, or the discussion that these types of understandings of what is race or racism, Muslims are people racist? The counter question is then, who is a race, who does a race belong, who are a race. Now, discussion of what is a race is quite complex in the sense that there is consensus among the thinkers on race or theoreticians working on race. That racism cannot be limited to biological or physiology. So skin color cannot be the determining factor. It is one of, but not the determining factor on racism. So one critique, of course, it goes back to this biological idea of racism, so that we can't take Islamophobia as racism. It's a religion and not a race. And the second is that what about cultural critiques of Islamophobia? So usually what happens is that overt forms of racism or overt forms of abuse or racial slurs or verbal abuse sometimes is easy to identify, becomes problematic. It masks itself as cultural critiques. So what happens is that racism, or the idea of racism, it retreats into the shell of what is a race and cultural critique. And even if there is some discrimination, it is more individual in nature. That an Islamophobe or a racist, he acts so because it is in his head. He has a misunderstanding, or there is something wrong with the way he thinks. So individual becomes the basic component of Islamophobia or any type of racism. Now, what the problem this creates is that the understanding of racism, if racism is determined on skin color or physiology, it creates two problems. One, the idea that even people with one particular skin color or the black community, that they form one race, it becomes questionable. So the idea that people in Africa, for example, which has thousands of languages, thousands of faiths, cultures, ways of knowing, ways of understanding, lifestyles, ways of living, different histories, different hundreds of different political histories, all these things are condensed into one single factor, that is skin color. So basically what we do is that every other variances, every other differences are completely taken out and it is reduced to one commonality. So what we do is that we create a monolith out of a particular community. When we say that it is only determined by skin color or the fact that they or people with black skin constitute one single race. Now, racism, or the idea of race, that people belong to specific races, has been contested since many years, since decades. That it has been proved false. So there is no thing called race. The race isn't real. You can't say that all black people, they belong to one race. All Jews, they belong to a single race. Or all Muslims are a single race. That idea of race doesn't exist. It's not real. There are differences, there are linguistic differences. They come from different parts of the world. They speak different languages, different cultures. So it's very difficult to maintain the argument that they are all one race. But despite that, despite the fact that race not being real, people are treated like a race. So even if you're a Muslim from India, or a Muslim from Japan, or a Muslim in the US, or a Muslim from the Middle East or Africa, it doesn't matter whether you are from different parts of the world, you speak different languages, or whether you are having different histories. The moment you walk through a security checkup in airport, you're treated as one. All those differences it contains. So despite it not being real, you're treated like it is real. So it has serious ramifications here. Now, the problem with the category of race again is that certain scholars say it's like chameleon in nature. It keeps on changing its color or character. It hides itself. For example, one of the most prominent race theoreticians, they would speak about this chameleonic nature of race. So what they mean by that is that in some instances, of course, the most visible and the most prominent instance of racism are, of course, anti-black racism. And that, of course, is distinguished by skin color. But then anti-Semitism is also understood or recognized as a form of racism. In anti-Semitism, it is not skin color that became the determining factor of racism. Rather, it was the Jewishness or Jewish identity or Jewish faith that became the marker for anti-Semitism or anti-Semitic racism. The same way, race is nebulous. It is very chameleonic. It depends on the social, political, historical context where it is, that how it is determined. Now, that is why certain scholars like David Theo Goldberg, they would go on to say that conceptually, that race is chameleonic, that it changes its color. So it can hide itself through individual emphasis. One, it can stick to the idea that it's individual, that is the basic unit or the basic perpetuator of racism. And it can also be politically rationalized in a way that stories, narratives could be marginalized. So if you look at, for example, how we are taught transatlantic slavery, or how it is picturized in popular culture, it's almost understood as the hand or the work of a few rotten apples, or slavery was something that happened in the US and not the UK. So in these sort of things, the understanding is that it is not marginal. Racism or any form of racism is not marginal. It is very foundational to most societies, especially to the UK and the US. So much so that many race scholars also see that the industrial revolution or capitalism would not have been possible without the transatlantic slave trade. And they would characterize capitalism rather as racial capitalism. So if race is not individual, if it is not biologically determined, if it is not centered only by the individual, then how can we understand race? How do we understand it? The same way, theologians, they would describe race as a political category. So here by political, what we mean is not that certain politicians or certain governments would harness the power of race to meet their vested interests at various moments. Rather, on the contrary, racism is political in the sense that it has become inherent in the structures of a political apparatus, the nation state, that is. The way a state is designed, the way it emerges, that is, it becomes a regulating principle, an organizing principle. So it becomes parallel relations. If you look at the history of race, it emerges increasingly in parallel with the development of the nation state. So many philosophers, political theoreticians have argued the same. Because otherwise, when the analysis of racism is an individual attitude rather than a political idea, it is usually coupled with the drive to, for example, frame colonialism in a positive light, or blame the problems in societies on, for example, the influx of immigrants or refugees, or victims being unhelpful. So because of these narratives, it becomes very imperative that we try to analyze racism from a very political point of view. So when he says that, or when thinkers of race compare this idea of nation state itself as being detrimental to how race or racism is produced. So what they would say is that race becomes fundamental to the emergence of nation state, to the development of a nation state, and to the transformation of a nation state. And it's the idea of racism in this format is not that it is sort of a hierarchy. It is more of an organizing principle. It decides who is in and who is out, who is included and who is excluded. And it also is not because that a state becomes racial due to the racial composition of its majority or the racial implications of policies, although both are important, but it is the way that the population is structured, the way citizenship laws are structured, the way how, again, an organizing principle decides who is in and who is not in. But that doesn't mean that, for example, even the people who, or the thinkers who would argue this, wouldn't mean that all states are actively racist. So they make a distinction between naturalist racism and historist racism. Historist racism is very easy to identify, and they are always condemned. For example, apartheid in South Africa, the Zionist state in Israel and over the Palestinian occupied territories, the Chinese treatment of the Uyghurs, the Rohingyas, and even to an extent, the treatment exclusion of Muslims in India. These could be easily identified. There will be explicit forms of racism. And the idea that, for example, Muslims cannot develop because they are unable to integrate themselves. or the idea that certain people with a skin color are so inferior to others who are superior. So these types of racism are always condemned, and it is very visibly identifiable. But what he speaks of as historicist, or what he calls the progressive form of racism, is that it establishes racism on the foundations of history and progress. Now, in this viewpoint, it is difficult to identify because it's not as explicit as the other forms of racism are. This viewpoint doesn't deny that the Muslim is incapable of advancement, but the Muslim can only advance or can only progress under the achievement of certain principles or guidelines. So, for example, the fact that if Muslims need to democratize more, they need to be more secular, they need to be more integrate, they need to integrate more. So these demands that if you need to be considered as equal citizens of a state, that you have to modernize, you have to democratize, you have to integrate, you have to secularize, these narratives that there is something lacking in already what you are. But the fact that if you take up these sort of categories, if you put these goals and aim towards these goals as a community, then you could be considered as equal citizens. And this sort of racism is quite difficult to identify for the fact that, one, it is not explicit as the other forms of racism, and also to the fact that sometimes we ourselves internalize these narratives that we need to, and we don't see it problematic, rather we see it as our problem. So these forms of racisms that are sometimes quite difficult to identify are often called by some scholars as colorblind racism or racism without racists. Now, what racism without racists does is that it helps sometimes it justify how, for example, socioeconomic disparities or structural forms of racism or systemic forms of racism, or the numbers that we see in terms of disparities of not just Muslims, but any other minority, ethnic minority communities as well. So when we look at these numbers, rather than looking at the explanation for what causes inequalities, what colorblind racism does is it finds other non-racial reasons to justify why a particular community performs badly in terms of social mobility or in terms of socio-economic advancement. So, for example, if you look at the statistics of the Muslim community, this is actually the full census data on housing and education impoverishment haven't come out. Only the ethnicity and age data have come out for the current census. The other data is supposed to come out by June, inshallah. So these are some of the data from 10 years back, and the present data is current 2019. When you look at it, for example, Muslims, despite the fact that they are around roughly 5% of the population, we have around more than 18 or 18% present population. We live in the most impoverished areas. We have increasing levels of education, but lower levels of employability. It is difficult for Muslims, at least in India and some other places, with the data that it's difficult to get loans. There's a form of redlining there in access to credits and loans. Again, Muslim women find employment difficult to access or gain. And it's also the last year there was even reports from Muslim doctors' bodies that 8 out of 10 Muslims working in the NHS or as health professions, they face racism and Islamophobia from their colleagues. So the only way, if we only resort to idea that racism is an individual perpetuated act, then it is very difficult to understand how to explain how these disparities exist. So for example, what they do is that they try to explain this or to explain their colorblind racism by recourse to these 4 frames. So, for example, one of the prominent race theoreticians, Bonla Silva, he would say that they take these frames of abstract liberalism, naturalization, cultural racism, and minimization of racism to explain or to justify, for example, in a non-racial way, why these disparities for Muslims exist. Although he was speaking from the context of the United States and looking at inequalities among African Americans, the same frames could be used to look at Muslim numbers as well. Now, for example, the frame of abstract or liberalism to deploy the logic of political liberalism, equal opportunity, and economic liberalism, that is individual choice, to explain social inequalities. So that the fact that Muslims are significantly underrepresented in employment or universities. These underrepresentation data is completely ignored of. And the fact that if you are motivated, the opportunity is there. If you're motivated, you can make it. So it becomes the individual again, thus foreclosing of the inquiry or discussion into why the system is like that. Then the other frame is naturalization. So it allows again to explain a racial phenomena or a racially directed socioeconomic disparity by labeling it as a natural occurrence. Now, this would help to again justify marginalization by locating it within the larger, maybe geographical imbalances or beyond the control of human actors. Maybe the economy is bad, the crash of economy, it is just a part of that. So these instances to seem it look very natural, that it is naturally occurring, and because naturally occurring, it is beyond human agency to correct it or to address it. Then the other frame is of cultural racism. So cultural racism, it will rest on the fact that culturally based arguments and stereotypes would justify. Now, for example, if you look at data on Muslim numbers on Muslim education in India, for example, they would compare and say that in certain places in India, there is an averse to education among the Muslim rural culture. They don't like. So it's a cultural thing, that's thing from education. Or that the reason why there is less women in education is because of Muslim men or the way Islam treats women, or their recourse to hijab and faith over education or any other forms of success. So again, a cultural aspect would be given to actually justify that. Then the third is again that a minimization of racism. So again, this justification is also given to show that there are other important factors, that there might be racial factors, but that might not be the dominating or the only factor. There are other factors that also influence why there are socioeconomic disparities. For example, again, because I look at studies in India a lot, some studies would hint that Muslim parents being less ambitious than non-Muslim parents in sending their children to school, educating children, or in getting a job, or the fact that the reason why there is poverty is because they get benefits. So because they get benefits, they don't want to go for jobs. So that's a culture of benefits. So these sort of frames are often used to describe or to justify these sorts of socioeconomic things. So what we have to see is that, of course, the most important aspects of Islamophobia is, and which is most visible, is its violence, the state security aspects and machinery often targeting Muslims as terrorists or fanatics. And if you look at this thing in the number of stop and search that has happened in the UK. So again, the question is whether Muslims must reform themselves or not. The debate goes there. At the same time, there have been reports in the UK, for example, the Macpherson report, 97, and then its evaluation later on in the Lamy report that actually looks at and admits that the security system, the police system in UK, it's inherently systemically racist. So we have reports that show that this system is inherently racist. But rather than looking at that and why it is so, why is that inherently, or what we can do to tackle the systemic racism of the police or something, the onus is on the Muslim community to actually self-surveillance themselves. So again, the reason I went through this sort of, you could say, a diversion on what race or racism is, to again go back to that definition of Islamophobia, of when Islamophobia is seen as a type of racism, to be understood as a type of racism that targets Muslimness or any perceived ideas of Muslimness. Because anything else, any other forms of understanding of Islamophobia, as I said, a biological, individual way of looking at it, a non-systemic way of looking at it, would not be able to explain the socioeconomic disparities. And it is not unique only to the UK. Disparities, if you look at India, if you look at other places like China, even France, for example, with similar numbers. So there is a certain logic that bends, even being India, that is outside Europe, or France, but inside Europe, despite the different political ideologies that these nations have, despite the composition of the ethnicities of these nations, the way that the governing logic works over Muslims or other ethnic minorities is the same. So again, that's very important that to tackle, we highlight and raise demands to criminalize Islamophobia by including it among the prevalent anti-racism laws in the UK. So I think I spoke for almost half an hour, and the remaining, inshallah, we could take in the Q&As. Jazakallah khair.
Shaheen, thank you very much for that introduction, because I think the biggest confusion has been on the question about race. I don't think anybody disagrees with violence and discrimination just because of their faith. I think it's this race. The question is, has there been any positive developments with people better understanding the racial component of this problem?
Yeah, for example, even when the first report came out in 1997, Islamophobia report by the Running Trust, it did also incline towards the idea of Islamophobia as racism. And one of the impacts of the report was that from 1997 onwards, the funding for Muslim schools, and later on the ethnic or Muslim as a category being included as an option in the religious category, and include this in the census, that we can get a better picture of Muslim numbers on. These were all direct impact of the first ready-made report in terms of policy, you could say. But in terms of understanding of racism, not Muslim communities, because we are still grappling over it in terms of understanding Islamophobia in that way. But other communities, for example, understanding anti-Semitism as racism or anti-Black racism itself, you look at their experiences, and not that it is there is no anti-Semitism, there is no anti-Black racism, but the advancements they have had in terms of dignity and self-assertion, it has helped a lot. Yes.
What about organizations that, because there's a lot of people on the call at the moment. So would there be, organizations that are now working exceptionally hard, that as individuals, we should actually very seriously consider trying to support and engage and volunteer? Is there something like a laundry list that we should be open to considering as allies?
Because this idea of Islamophobia as racism was, it is backed and supported by the MCB, which is the largest Muslim confederation. And they have been consistently raising demands with MPs, with policymakers to recognize Islamophobia as so. But then, of course, it takes more effort to actually, for the government or for people in power to recognize and implement it. So the MCB has been doing it for a long time, and the new term of the MCB started this year. Islamophobia and tackling Islamophobia is one of its priorities. It's the number one priority of the coming years was for the MCB. So as MCB is a confederation of almost 500 organizations in the UK. So of course it represents the larger voice of Muslims as well. So working towards that in that confederation would actually, inshallah, help.
So is there an awareness problem amongst the Muslim community? Because, there's perhaps maybe not so much in the past, because now there are definitive efforts to, define it, identify it, create advocacy motion. But is there, or is there the other extreme where you have people in the community who actually are in denial about its racial component?
Yes, as I said, there is sort of sometimes denial and pushback, the racial component. But those critiques and put of course articles on that. My colleagues written an article on that. So these understandings of criticisms come from this very limited idea of what race or racism is. Again, it comes from a limited, not of race and racism of even a category religion is. So it is these categories sometimes that we get mixed up, or we limit, reduce in a very reductive way its larger meaning. And we reduce it to something else. And when we reduce it, then we see problems with these definitions or these slogans. So in case of awareness, no, I think the awareness, there has been quite an increased effort at awareness. The number of, if you look at, if you compare the number of books and studies and events that is happening every year on Islam, not only in the UK, but globally as well. And of course, now with the, you have people who haven't spoken on Islamophobia ever in the last 2 days, commenting on it, speaking on it, seeing it as a problem because of the UN's recognition of International Day for Islamophobia. So of course there is awareness created, but I think what we need is a more call for action, a more press for action.
One more question that I thought Shaheen would be very, very pertinent, given that this month in particular, where we observe International Women's Day, the findings show that women are disproportionately targeted as victims of the scourge. What in particular can be done to try to tide this, and what are the challenges that the community faces?
Yeah, it is true that women are proportionally affected, and sometimes legislations specifically impacting women. For example, the hijab ban in France and other places in parts of India as well, because women, especially those with hijabs, it become more visible. The more visible they are, the more they become targeted in that way. And it's not just targeted legislation, also to get jobs as well. So, for example, you will see a very high number, not high, increasing number since the last 10 years of Muslim women in universities, undergrads and postgrads. But then if you look at the employability rates, it comes down. So there is what you call a problem in that, the way they are perceived, or the way that the perception whether they can be employed or not. So in terms of employment, in terms of social mobility, and in terms of actual violence itself, sometimes Muslim women are targeted more than men. And this creates a problem now. The way to, of course, to tackle it, it cannot be tackled as separately or say issue only affecting, it affects everybody. So that is why there are a lot of studies under the tag gendered Islamophobia, that Islamophobia has a very gendered aspect as well, because then it becomes preoccupied. For example, in France, the state becomes preoccupied with the Muslim woman's dressing or Muslim woman's body. So then again, the only way to tackle is again, as I said, a call for action and mobilization, and then raising the demands.
I also thought it'd be useful that I know this is a bit of a plug, but Strive UK will for the third time organize its its women's conference at the East London Mosque in a few weeks. Details will come. This is an event where women from all walks of life get together, work on what we need to do as a community to combat Islamophobia. The details will be in shortly.
Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Shaheen. My name is Dr. Zibrail Islam. Thank you very much, first of all, for arranging this session. And secondly, thank you very much for letting us all join the session. So my question is how to handle and respond to this systematic Islamophobia that is protected by the laws such as freedom of expression. You must be aware of the recent Quran incident in Sweden as well. And I have a couple of follow-up questions after you respond to this, please.
Yeah, just to rephrase, to make sure I got your question right. What you asked is that how do we tackle the systemic nature of Islamophobia?
Yes, and the freedom of expression and, it's protected by law. Anybody can start and do anything.
Yeah. So basically, first, the problem is that when something is systemic in nature, discrimination, Islamophobia, any forms of racism, when it becomes systemic, the law is part of that system. And it takes time to change. For example, the most explicit, or you can say the most brutal forms of racism, be it the slave trade, it was at one point legal, and it was mainstream. The Jim Crow laws of segregation in the US, apartheid, it is all legally sanctioned by those particular regimes and governments. In China, most of the brutalities done against the Uyghurs in China, those are also, for the Chinese, it's legal. The Israeli policies in the occupied territories, the different sets of laws they have, it's completely, as far as they're concerned, it's illegal. So the problem with the category legal doesn't hold much weight unless it is pushed to change. Now, for example, the problems that, if you look at the Jewish community, for example, let's also look at the Jewish community, its history of resistance in the 30s and 40s as well. They also suffered gravely from systemic forms of anti-Semitism all across Europe when before Nazi Germany. For example, in the UK, the British Union of Fascists was a legitimate political party, at least in the early 1940s. and they used to keep all these violent marches to threaten the Jewish community especially in East London, where it was a Jewish ghetto sort of. So despite their protests to the state, to the cop, to the police system, there was nothing being done. And they used to come hold these regular marches in their brown shirts, threaten the Jewish community, break their shops, and create all sorts of ruckus. And the way they realized is that there is no point of just asking for loss. There is no point asking. They continued with mobilization, mass mobilization and protests. For example, there are studies of history that's called the Battle of Cable Street. That is the intervention of the Jewish community with the British fascists against them. It was happened in this place called Cable Street. So if you look at all these, if you look at, for example, the African American community, look at the 1940s, most Muslim leaders in South Asia, most prominent Muslim leaders in South Asia, they would see the African American community in the US as the paradigm of oppression. And many of the speeches you would see that they would speak in a way that we don't want the Muslim community here in India or in Pakistan to become like the African Americans in the US. The idea being that they are the most systemically deprived or they have the most levels of poverty or oppression. But then what we see is that if you look at later on the American Civil Rights Movement, the Civil Rights Movement, the way it was organized, the way it was mobilized, of course, it had a strong faith element to it. Apart from that, the opposition, that is the government, actually thought that America would come to a standstill. The system would break down. That was the strength of the mobilization protest. It's only by that what was earlier considered legal was changed. The same way in terms of anti-Semitism, what was earlier considered legal was changed. No changes happen because we just give a petition or we give a demand and they listen to it and they get rational, they get convinced, and then they say, okay, it's fine. These changes happen only by highlighting the issue, by looking at the depth of the socioeconomic disparities that exist and trying to explain it, and then raising demands on it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shaheen.
I hope I answered your question.
Yes, I'm glad that you mentioned slavery and gave me very comprehensive examples. So I will share very briefly. I'll share some of my experience. As soon as I started thinking about this 4 years ago, and I wanted to do this, push this legally. So we had 3 individuals. So what I did, Dr. Shaheen, was we had 3 individuals. We started a court case against this person who heard the Quran in Sweden. We started the legal proceeding. We had invited the lawyers and everything. So we also filed a petition in the UK Parliament. But my impression or my feeling during all this, and also you also mentioned that I feel that Muslims are not responsible to an extent for not responding or standing up for themselves. Like all we have done is spread awareness, and when will we start fighting actually? Because if you look at the Human Rights Careers website, they have listed 10 most pressing human rights issues. Islamophobia is not one of them. The world will not start responding to this until we stand up. And we, as individuals, as I told you, we are 3 individuals who started this court case, and it's just in the beginning. But when we started this and we started reaching out to people, we started feeling that standing up for Islamophobia or fighting for your religion or your rights is not one of the priorities of Muslims. What would you say to that? Thank you very much.
Yeah, Jazakallah khair. I don't think I am well equipped to actually comment or advise on how a legal battle can be found. But what you said is right, that there is a clear lack of awareness. Especially, for example, if you were to look at, again, a Jewish community, for example, and if you go to if you just for experiment's sake, you take any random synagogue in the UK and take any random Jewish person from the synagogue and ask him what anti-Semitism is. He knows exactly what anti-Semitism is. He knows its definition, what it is. He knows what it is about. Also, the same way you ask him, what would you do if you are discriminated against? Or if something is done against you that discriminates you on the basis of your Jewishness. He knows what to do. He knows what laws are in place. He or she, they know what mechanism is in place. They know how to go forward with that. The same way with the Black community. If you ask them if they face discrimination or racial discrimination in some way or form, how to go about it, what to do about it, they know, because they fought for it. They know the mechanisms in place. They know how to go about it. They know how to identify that it is racism. Most of the time, sometimes we don't identify that we are being discriminated upon. That one becomes a problem. Second is that sometimes, because of the lack of awareness of these things and the severity, we miss the severity of it or the gravity of it, how to go about it. So there is, of course, a lack of awareness of how impactful Islamophobia is on us. And the other sad thing is that sometimes, even if we keep events, the Muslim organizations, or the way we are configured is in a way that we to deal with something, we keep an event, a talk or a program or something, or a post or a poster, or maximum is a press release. So if we have to go beyond that, commemorating something by just a talk or just recognizing it or just commenting on it, because it calls again for action. If you look at any other community that has successfully in one way or the other tackled discrimination or racism, it is not through sitting on the rights and saying that it happens. It is by mobilizing and fighting for it. So, as I said, briefly discuss an outline of anti-Semitism, the struggle against that, and even the struggle against, for example, the anti-Black racism, the anti-civil rights movement, the George Floyd Black Lives Matter movement, the impact it had. So, unless there is an impact, there is an action in that way, a call for action in that way, things won't change. And as you said rightly, that we need to step up in that way to actually get something done about it. Yes.
Shaheen, there's a question that's come in from the chats about any examples during the time of the Prophet, examples of Islamophobia and how it was tracked. Would you care to address that, please?
I think that terms or concepts like Islamophobia, racism, and most like these modern concepts, we can't use those concepts back into history. It's a different phenomena. Otherwise, if there is no beginning for discrimination, there will not be an end for it. So if you look at even racism, most scholars would say the origin of racism being around the 18th century, or maybe even way back at the 14th, 15th centuries, and not more than that. Because if we again limit Islamophobia or limit racism to only verbal slurs or verbal abuse or physical direct confrontation attacks, if we limit it to that, then you could go back in history towards the first community that ever lived, or even during the time of the Prophet. But to say that that's something that happened there, of course it could be categorized as haram, it could be bad practice, bad adab, everything, and something undesirable, something not to be done, and not being unbecoming of proper conduct as a Muslim. These all could be made about that. But to say that it was racism is actually stretching the concept back and making it too general in that way. So we wouldn't actually address that. For example, a companion, Abu Dhar al-Ghifari, actually abusing verbally Bilal and Anhu in anger, that would be seen as a slur, as bad speech, as using bad language. It's unbecoming of a Muslim. Rightly the Prophet advised him so. But that doesn't mean that is racism, because racism becomes a more hierarchical, systemic governing principle. That is where racism is identified. So it is from that governing principle, or that's the organizing principle, when a slur or thing happens, become racist. The other one, individual itself, doesn't become racist in that way. It's of course not something to be done. It's bad. It's bad, unbecoming of a Muslim, but that couldn't be categorized as racism as we understand it.
we have a few more minutes, so if there are more questions, please
there's
raise
one
your
more
hands.
Naeem, I think there's one more question from Sabine on the chat. How can we reduce or tackle Islamophobia? Is it by increasing awareness that Muslims are also normal people who want a normal life? That's his question.
Yeah, I think it becomes when you think of it in one way, it is quite unfortunate, sad that we have to tell that we are normal, not abnormal, to convince people not to be Islamophobic or racist. So even that proposition itself becomes a bit problematic in that sense that we have to get to an effort to say that we are normal. And just because we consider it, would we be considered normal? Or what is the cost that we have to take to become called normal? That's usually what happens. The idea that you have to secularize, modernize, democratize, to integrate. So these narratives, what they show is that is set as what the normal. It depends on what you mean by normal. What is the normal that we have to get into? To be considered normal. So what is the cost of that? So why can't we be treated rightly by the way we are? Of course, there are differences. Between us, and even inside there are differences. But why should all differences be seen as be identified by a racial difference rather than just difference? So that also becomes problematic. Then this thing is that it is not about, again, talking to somebody is not the problem here. Systemic racism, for example, the structural aspect of it, the socio-economic, political aspect of it, that cannot end by just speaking to people. For example, when we say that when the Muslim doctors in the NHS say in a recent report, that they are being rightly discriminated, or 8 out of 10 feel discriminated, or 4 out of 6 feel discriminated, or whatever the data are. So whom do they speak to in that sense? And we consider them to be the most educated. So if all spheres of activity, be it NHS, or be it any other forms, be it universities, or be it the space itself, how do we understand that if it's only us speaking to people one-on-one? So when you look at the incarceration rates of Muslims, 18% or 19%, we are only 5% of the population, but we have 4 times higher present population rate. So rather than blaming it on, bad attitudes or bad behavior became criminals, it's important to look at what the systemic effect of it is. How much of the social or impoverishment actually contributes to a higher prison population rate. For example, there are a lot of studies from the Black community on it. They have done tons of studies on it, especially in the US, where it is much higher for them. So you could find from the 70s onwards, voluminous number of studies that shows the higher prison populations directly linked to systemic socioeconomic discrimination and impoverishment and poverty. So if that is there, for example, one particular area, it would be a Black area, it could be a Muslim area, the funding for schools or green spaces or youth activities would be much lesser in comparison to another, non-Muslim or non-Black area. And these things impact a person's choices, their career choices, the things they want, their opportunities and everything. So, but without taking those into account, just saying that Muslims, they tend to be criminal. That is the reason why there is a high rate of Muslim prison population. That becomes problematic.
Shaheen, perhaps we could take this as the last question, unless there is something else pressing. So this was a question that's also on the chat, but I just thought I'd also expand this. You know how there is this accusation of victimhood, which is, there is, of course, the very, very, very clear thing that Islamophobia happens not because of what Muslims do, but it's because of who Muslims are. However, this accusation about victimhood, that seems to be prevalent. And the second one is it possible that Islamophobia is on the rise because of how Muslims are, I think the accusation is politicizing faith, or whatever that means.
So, for example, not Islamophobia, even last year, the Jewish Board of Deputies, they also said that there was a high rise in anti-Semitism as well. And there is a high, equally higher rise in anti-black racism as well. That is post-Brexit. Post-Brexit, there's been an increase, 40% increase in hate crimes against all ethnic minorities, Muslims, Jews, and the black community as well. Now, why is it that it's only Muslims and is linked to maybe politicization being a problem when the same thing is not said about other communities who suffer from discrimination? Okay, there is no question of asking whether there is a high increase. I think in 2019 they said almost 130% increase. I think much more than that increase in anti-Semitism in the UK or across Europe as well, and much more across Europe. So there is no question in that. Are Jews, is the action of some Jews that relates, are they to be blamed, is the community blamed for the rise in anti-Semitism, or is the black community to be blamed in terms of the high level of violence, both from the state and by people against the black community? Those questions don't arise there. And not only it doesn't arise, those questions still would be seen as racist in nature. It would be seen as anti-Semitic in nature if those questions were asked. But only in terms of Muslims, these questions are asked. So again, the idea is that what motivates those questions only to a particular community and not to others when they are being discriminated against. So that very questioning itself reflects a form of Islamophobia in that.
Thank you, Shaheen. And I think this should be the last question. I mean, we could go on all day, and it's only fair that, the time that we promised that we can, maybe this is the last question. So there's a question from Amara. Why are there grave differences between anti-Semitic laws and Islamophobia? It's rarely recognized. Hence now, as you reported, the low report rate.
Yeah, there is, of course, there's no doubt there's a grave difference globally in the West specifically between anti-Semitic laws, because there are no laws on Islamophobia to compare in the first place. We don't have any law on Islamophobia. We know there's a term Islamophobia. We know this is what it means. We know that Muslims are affected. We know the details, the numbers of how many Muslims are affected. We know all that, but we don't have a law. So it's not that there's a difference between laws. There is no law to actually be a difference there. So there are very strict, stringent anti-Semitic laws. And it is because they have fought for it. It's not that they got a gift from the Jewish community has in the last more than a century or more than that. Their sufferings of anti-Semitism in the last at least 400, 500 years in Europe and the UK. And very seriously the last 100 years and before that. And of course, the Nazi policies in Germany. They have actually fought for those laws. And it is due to their struggle and due to their mobilization that they got these laws implemented. We don't have anywhere although even the UN recognizes it. UN doesn't call for any criminalization of it or the need for a legal recourse to actually address Islamophobia. So there is no laws on Islamophobia. So the demand is that we need laws on Islamophobia. And the advantage of including it in racism is that you don't need to, because there are already anti-racism laws in the UK. There are laws on anti-black racism. There are laws on anti-Semitic racism. So what we can do is you don't have to make a separate law for Islamophobia. You can just include Islamophobia in the set of laws that deal with racisms. So it becomes, even in a legal way, it becomes easier that way. Rather than going about a new definition, it becomes more pragmatic in that way. But even despite, as I said, the Islamophobia as racism definition, if it's a working definition, and if that is accepted, for example, the Labour Party initially accepted it, 2019 when the definition was first agreed upon. The Lib Dems, they accepted it. The Green parties accepted it, but the Conservatives didn't accept it. Even several police bodies also sort of accepted that this law can be made, but there was stiff opposition from the Conservative Party owned majority that this cannot be made into a law. The definition is not proper in that sense. Hence the reason why. And we also, if you look at the Muslim organizations and communities as well, although we keep events on Islamophobia, we end up emphasizing the individual aspect of it. So the solutions would come tackling is that we talk to people, we need to give a clear understanding of Islam. Of course, that is needed, that we need to talk to people about Islam, but that is not a solution, because we see it in a very individualistic sense that you go to one person, you convey to that person what the truth is. So he will sort of understand, convince, and then you go to the next person. So person to person, awareness is the way we usually talk about, rather than looking at it in its systemic way or seeing that as an ideology in itself. So unless we don't see it that way and then raise for demands, because only if we see it that way, we'll understand we need a demand. And the issue of Islamophobia is more than physical slurs. It is more than being stopped at the airport. It is much more than that. It impacts more people than can imagine. So unless we first attest to that fact, and then we create a demand and mobilize for that demand, there wouldn't be any laws on that.
All right, I think we'll call it a wrap, but thank you so very much, Dr. Shaheen, for your time. And I thank everybody who's joined on the call for your questions, your contributions, and more importantly, for your desire to understand how we combat it. And inshallah, Ameen Ya Rab, with Allah's help, your commitment to fight against this scourge that not only affects people of our faith, but people of all faiths, and is indeed a huge problem. And sadly, as with every form of racism, takes an immense amount of time to first to recognize and then to mobilize and then to actually reach the point of having legislations, which in itself is still not a panacea to all the ills that racism brings in. On behalf of Strive, I would like to thank everybody for joining our call. And with this, we end our session today. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Jazakallah khair.